So today I'm going to talk about optimizing potentially optimizing lifespan through biohacking. So we've got a few learning objectives, and I'm going to try my best to get through the first four. We may not get to optimizing the oral microbiome, but we're going to go over blood-based biological clocks, epigenetic testing, how I use diet tracking to optimize blood biomarkers, and then optimizing cardiovascular fitness metrics, including the resting heart rate and heart rate variability. And then, like I said, if we get to it, we'll go through the oral microbiome. All right, so I have no disclosures. All right, so in August, I blood tested for the 5th time in 2022. So with that in mind, what was my biological age? So this is using Dr. Morgan Levine's phenotypic age calculator, which is a metric of biological age. And as you can see, it contains 9 blood test variables and chronological age. And when crunching the numbers, I get a biological age of 34 years, which is 15.6 years younger than my chronological. So it could be actually a bit lower than that. My high sensitivity C-reactive protein measurement was at Quest's limit of detection, 0.3, so that could actually be less than 0.3. And this is only one test. So for more context, let's have a look at biological age results since 2018. And since then, I have 20 blood tests. So we can see that here. We've got, again, Levine's biological age on the y-axis, plotted against time. So from 2018 to 2019, I just started collecting data. I wasn't measuring C-reactive protein at every blood test because it's not something you get on a, typically it's not something you get at your yearly physical. So I had to have it as an add-on test. Nonetheless, over those first 3 tests, my average biological age using Levine's test was 36.1 years. Over 6 tests in 2020, 35.6. 6 tests in 2021, again, 35.6. And thus far, over the first 5 tests in 2022, my average is currently 33.9 years. So I've further reduced it by 1.7 years. And beyond just looking at averages, for year to year, are they different? Are the averages different from year to year? When doing a 2-sample t-test, these are right at the border of statistical significance. And I should say I tested my 6th blood test on Monday, posted that on my YouTube channel, or it's going to get posted tomorrow. So this is a little bit of old news, new news coming tomorrow. But nonetheless, this is a significant difference for a reduced biological age when compared with 2020 to 2021. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is by looking at the chronological age minus biological age. So the magnitude of that reduction, how far apart they are when compared with chronological age. So prior to 2022, my average chronological age minus biological age reduction over 15 tests was about 12 years, 11.9 to be exact. Thus far in 2022, I've further reduced that for every test. 16.4, you can see with a low of 13.6. The greatest difference being 17.2 years, with an average 2022 average chronological age minus biological age reduction of 15.3 years. So I've further reduced that disparity between chronological age and biological age from about 12 years prior to 2022 to more than 15 years in 2022. Now, what I haven't gone through is how good is this metric for its ability to predict biological age. And so we'll take a look at that, and then how well does it associate with all-cause mortality risk? And that can give us some insight about how good or not that this test is as a predictor of biological age. So Levine's test is strongly correlated with chronological age, and we can see that in 2 separate studies, NHANES 3 and NHANES 4, and these were relatively large studies. You can see about 10,000 and more than 11,000 people. So the correlation for this test with chronological age was 0.94 and 0.96. So a perfectly linear is 1.0. So these are as close as you can get, or pretty close to as close as you can get, for almost perfectly being linearly correlated with biological age. And we can see that graphically represented here. So phenotypic age, again, Levine's test biological age, plotted against chronological age. You can see that almost perfectly linear red line there. Now, Levine's chronological age correlation with this 0.94 to 0.96 range is as good as the best epigenetic clock for predicting chronological age, which is the Horvath test. And probably most people know about the epigenetic tests and the Horvath test, but just to illustrate, this data will we'll see that this data, just using conventionally measured blood biomarkers, is as good as the best epigenetic test for its ability to predict chronological age. So for that data for Horvath, that's what we can see here, DNA M age, so DNA methylation age, or epigenetic age, using the Horvath clock, plotted against chronological age. And you can see that there are lots of different colored circles. That's because this is a multi-tissue clock. Question?
Yeah, in Levine's study, it looks like they were testing then, if I read this correctly, 20-year-olds to 90-year-olds, and correlating their blood work with their chronological age.
Yep.
And that's the number of almost 20,000 people.
This study, it's two separate studies, about 10,000, 11,000 each. But yeah, yep. So the Horvath test is a multi-cell and tissue clock, as listed here. So breast cells, buccal cells, brain, colon, cord blood, et cetera. And we can see that the correlation for epigenetic age using the Horvath test with chronological age is 0.94, which is as good as the Levine's test, or vice versa. Now, Levine's test isn't just strongly correlated with chronological age, it's also been shown to be associated with all-cause mortality risk, and that's what we can see here, all-cause mortality risk. This is a study of about 11,000 people. So for every 1-year increase in biological age using Levine's test, all-cause mortality increases by 9%, which we can see there. And that association was true regardless of age groups, whether looking at young, middle-aged, or older. You can see that as biological age increases using Levine's metric, all-cause mortality risk increases for each of those age groups. And this is true, too, for disease-specific mortality. So an increased biological age using Levine's test was associated with an increased mortality risk from heart disease, cancer, chronic lower respiratory disease, but not cerebrovascular disease, diabetes-related mortality, influenza or pneumonia. And then interestingly, as a side note, up to 15 years before the pandemic, people who had an older biological age using Levine's test had an increased mortality risk after COVID-19 diagnosis. And then last but not least, an older Levine's biological age is associated with an increased mortality risk from kidney-related issues, including nephritis or nephrosis. Now, Levine's test isn't the only blood-based biomarker panel that can easily assess biological age, and the other one that I'm going to go through is Aging.ai. And I should mention that Levine's test and Aging.ai are free to use, which for me is very practical. I don't think you should have to spend money for something that's been peer-reviewed and published. So Aging.ai, that's the website. And I'm not sponsored. I have no affiliation with either of these two groups. So Aging.ai, in contrast with Levine's test, it has 19 input biomarkers, and these are found on the standard chemistry panel and complete blood count, CBC, which is about a $35 test. So when including high sensitivity C-reactive protein for Levine's test together with these two biological age metrics, it's less than $80 US USD. So Aging.ai's correlation for its for the 19 biomarkers with chronological age is 0.8, so not as strong as the Levine test, but still pretty good. And note that chronological age isn't in its model, so this is 0.8 without chronological age. All right, so how does it relate? How does Aging.ai relate to all-cause mortality risk? So just like Levine's test, biological ages that were younger than their corresponding chronological age were associated with a reduced all-cause mortality risk, and we can start to see that here. First, in a Canadian cohort, so people that had biological ages using Aging.ai that were greater than 5 years older than their chronological age had a significantly increased all-cause mortality risk. And then conversely, people who had at least a 5-year younger biological age using Aging.ai had a significantly reduced all-cause mortality risk, as shown there. And then similar data was found in a US cohort, so using NHANES. So older age, increased all-cause mortality risk, younger Aging.ai age, a significantly reduced all-cause mortality risk. All right, so what's my data? How do I fit into this context? So when putting up the data for the 19 biomarkers that are on Aging.ai, as shown there, if anyone wants to double check my math, I get a predicted age of 31 years, which is 18.6 years younger than my chronological. Now, this is just one test, and anytime someone tells me that they've got one test or two tests, is that truly representative of what's going on systemically? So I think more tests helps to tell the story. So for more context, let's take a look at my data since 2009, and I have 35 blood tests over that period. So we've got Aging.ai, biological age, 2009 to 2022, Aging.ai on the y-axis. So back in 2009, I wasn't testing very often. I was just going once a year to my doctor and then recording that data in an Excel file. But nonetheless, over 3 tests over about that 5-year period, 2009 to 2013, average Aging.ai age was 32 years. And then in 2016, I decided to kick it up a notch and test more often. And then from 2016 to 2021, 27 tests with an average Aging.ai age of 29.9 years. So what about 2022? That's what we can see here. And this is through the first 5 tests. It was actually 33 years for test number 6. But again, that's on my YouTube channel tomorrow. So after the first 5 tests in 2022, my average Aging.ai age was 29. So rather than making the jump and saying I've further improved that too, I think what the fair thing to say is that my Aging.ai age is consistently in the 29 to 32 year age range, regardless of my chronological age, regardless if I was in my early 30s or approaching 50. So what about epigenetic testing? What's my biological age using that? So to go through that, I'm going to go through 3 tests, Horvath, which I just introduced, Hannum, and then a third, Dunedin Pace. And then for each of these tests, just like we did for the Levine test and Aging.ai, what's their correlation with chronological age? What's their association with all-cause mortality risk? And then what's my data? So first, Horvath's test, which is also known as the IEAA, Intrinsic Epigenetic Age Acceleration, which is a bit of a confusing name. So Horvath's epigenetic test for short. So this is a measure of cell intrinsic aging. So how does it correlate? We saw with chronological age. So we saw that here with those 2 tests, 0.94. And then there's a second iteration of the Horvath test, Horvath 2, which also had a very strong correlation with chronological age of 0.85. So once again, we can see Horvath, regardless of the iteration, is strongly correlated with chronological age. What about all-cause mortality risk? So Horvath's test is significantly correlated, significantly associated with all-cause mortality risk. This is a meta-analysis of 13 studies, including more than 13,000 people. And when putting up the meta-analysis hazard ratio and p-value, you can see that for a relatively older Horvath age, there's a significant increase in all-cause mortality risk. But if there's a weakness in these data, this is a relatively small but significant increase for the hazard ratio. It's 1.4%. All right, so what's my Horvath epigenetic age? And this is actually where the story turns and doesn't go how I expected. So I've tested epigenetic age now twice. I sent my 3rd sample out for analysis on Monday in concert with my blood test number 6 data. My first epigenetic test using Horvath was in May of 2022, and I got an age of about 59 years, so with rounding about 6 years older than my chronological age. So then I retested about 6 weeks later in July of 2022, and same ballpark, 53.5 years. In this case, about 4 years older than my chronological age. So to add insult to injury, Horvath's test may be related to longevity, and we know that because centenarian offspring have a lower intrinsic epigenetic age acceleration when compared with age-matched controls. And we can see that here. So IEAA on the y-axis, and then we can see that centenarians had a significantly lower Horvath epigenetic age when compared with age-matched controls. So that's potentially not good news for me, and that's one of the reasons why I'm attempting to biohack the heck out of aging if I can. I don't have longevity genes, and that may be one explanation for these data. The longest lived person in my family was 95. None of the men besides my dad, who's currently 80, lived past 67. So if I'm going to get to my goal of living longer than anyone that's ever lived, I'm going to really have to science the heck out of it. At worst, I see it as living as long as my genetics will allow, regardless of breaking any longevity records. All right, so this is the bad news in terms of my epigenetic age. There is good news, though, and that starts with data for the Hannum epigenetic clock, which is known as the EEAA, Extrinsic Epigenetic Age Acceleration, and this has been designated as a marker of immune system aging. So just like we did for all the other tests, how is this clock related to chronological age and all-cause mortality risk? So Hannum's clock is significantly correlated with chronological age, and we can see that here. So DNA M age, again, epigenetic age on the y-axis, plotted against chronological age using that multi-cell and tissue clock. And we can see a significant correlation for the Hannum epigenetic test with chronological age albeit with a weaker correlation coefficient of 0.68, but still highly statistically significant, as you can see by that p-value. So Hannum's epigenetic test is also significantly associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk, using that same meta-analysis of 13 studies that we saw for the Horvath data. And when putting up the meta-analysis hazard ratio and p-value, we can again see that Hannum's epigenetic age, or a relatively older Hannum epigenetic age, is significantly associated with a 2.9% increased all-cause mortality risk. All right, so what's my data for Hannum's epigenetic age? So on the first test, 36.87, so that was 12 years younger than my chronological age, which kind of agrees with the blood-based biological clocks. And just to illustrate why this is thought of as a marker of immune cell aging is because it adjusts for immune cell parameters, including B cells, CD4 and CD8 T cells, NK or natural killer cells, and then the amounts of basically the differentials for white blood cells, lymphocytes, neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, and the CD4 to CD8 ratio. All right, so that was the first test. What about the second? And essentially the same data, 12 years younger than my chronological age. So consistently, I've got a 12-year younger Hannum epigenetic age. All right, so next up is the Dunedin Pace epigenetic test, which is, the name comes from the Dunedin study, and then PACE stands for the pace of aging, calculated from the epigenome. So just like we did for every other test, how is this test related to chronological age and all-cause mortality risk? So first, when looking at the correlation for Dunedin Pace with chronological age, we can see a significant correlation, albeit this is the weakest of the epigenetic tests. So why would I even include this data? Why is this epigenetic test important if there are others that are more strongly correlated with chronological age? Especially, when considering the Hannum data with the correlations 0.94, 0.85 compared to 0.32, and Hannum 0.68, again, when compared with 0.32. So where this epigenetic test shines, Dunedin Pace, is for its association with all-cause mortality risk and its ability to detect the biological age reduction induced by CR, calorie restriction, in a human study. So first, Dunedin Pace is as good as the best epigenetic clocks for their association with all-cause mortality risk, and we'll take a look at two different studies to illustrate that point. So first, this was a study of men, relatively small, 771 people, and then we're looking at the mortality effect size hazard ratio, or risk for all-cause mortality on the y-axis. And then we've got 6 different epigenetic clocks on the x. First, Dunedin Pace, an older iteration of Dunedin Pace, which is Dunedin POAM, Pace of Aging Methylation. And then we've got Horvath and Hannum. And then we've got PhenoAge, which has the same name as the blood-based biomarker test that I showed earlier, but this is the DNA methylation version of PhenoAge, so it's a separate test. They don't relate at all in terms of if you have blood-based biomarker data, can you predict your DNA methylation using PhenoAge? You can't. It's a completely separate test. And then last but not least, for the epigenetic test, GrimAge, which in many studies has been shown to be significantly associated with all-cause mortality risk. All right, so what does the data say? So for that, we look at the hazard ratio of 1, and then where the data, where the confidence interval is either completely above or below, we have statistical significance. So first, starting with Horvath and Hannum, in contrast with the meta-analysis data that I showed earlier, in this study, both of these epigenetic tests were not significantly associated with all-cause mortality risk. In contrast, both Dunedin iterations of the Dunedin epigenetic test were as good as the PhenoAge and GrimAge for their ability to be associated with all-cause mortality risk. All right, so in the second study, Framingham offspring, this included both men and women, and again, going to the hazard ratio, again, we see that the Horvath test was close to being significantly associated with all-cause mortality risk, but it wasn't significantly associated, whereas the Hannum test was, PhenoAge and GrimAge also were. But once again, we see that Dunedin Pace is as good as these other epigenetic clocks, Hannum, PhenoAge, and GrimAge, for their associations with all-cause mortality risk. So the best data for Dunedin Pace, though, is that a younger biological age for people on calorie restriction was identified by this epigenetic clock, but not by the other epigenetic clocks. And this was a 2-year randomized controlled trial of calorie restriction in people. So the average calorie restriction in this study was about 12%. So the expectation is that people on CR would have a younger epigenetic age, or DNA methylation epigenetic age, when compared with people who ate as much as they wanted whenever they wanted. And in support of that, in previous studies, blood-based biomarker biological age was improved for people on CR. So what about epigenetic age? So for that, let's take a look at how each of these epigenetic clocks was, how it looked for people on CR when compared with ad lib. So first we've got the Horvath clock on the left, and then the Hannum clock on the right. And then we've got 3 time points. So they were evaluated at baseline, 1 year after being on CR, and then 24 months after being on CR. And then the 2 groups, ad lib in black, and then the red triangles are calorie restriction. So as you can see, though, so first they started at the same epigenetic age at baseline, and that was true for all of the clocks. But then there was no significant difference in terms of epigenetic age using the Horvath clock for people on ad lib or on CR. Now, if anything, you know, an argument can be made that there is some separation here for the red triangles, but that would be for an older epigenetic age for the people on CR. Nonetheless, the data was not statistically significant, so we can't conclude anything other than there wasn't a difference in epigenetic age using the Horvath test for people on CR for up to 2 years. Similar data was also found for the Hannum clock, virtually overlapping data. So Hannum's epigenetic clock wasn't able to detect epigenetic age differences for people on CR when compared with ad lib. So what about phenoage and grim age, which were consistently associated with all-cause mortality risk in the previous slide? So just like these other 2 epigenetic clocks, not significantly different. And again, you can see some separation here for CR versus ad lib, even though it wasn't statistically different. But again, that would be for an older age for CR when compared with ad lib. So what about the Dunedin epigenetic test? So looking at the first iteration, Dunedin Pace, this too was not significantly different when comparing CR versus ad lib for the epigenetic changes as a result of the 2-year RCT. But now we start to see some separation using Dunedin Pace. After 12 months on CR, we see that the CR group indeed had a lower epigenetic age. And then at 24 months, they also had a younger epigenetic age when compared with people who are eating an ad lib diet. So with that in mind, when considering that Dunedin Pace is the only epigenetic clock that was able to detect epigenetic age or a slower epigenetic age as a result of calorie restriction, what's my data? So for my first test, my Dunedin Pace value was 0.8, as shown there. So what does that mean? So the slowest epigenetic aging rate would be 0.6. And that means that for every 1 year of chronological age, epigenetic age increases by 0.6 years. So for my 0.8, that means for every year that passes, my epigenetic age increases by 0.8 years. In contrast, the fastest epigenetic aging rate would be 1.4. So for every 1 year of chronological age, epigenetic age would increase by 1.4 years. So not terrible. I've got some room for improvement. I want to get it. Obviously, I want to, you know, everyone wants to be the best that they can be. So 0.6 is the goal. So that was the first test. For the second test, my Dunedin Pace value was 0.82. So essentially reproducible data separated by 6 weeks. So not bad. All right, so to summarize the epigenetic age clocks, so I have a relatively older Horvath epigenetic age. One reason may be because of longevity genes. And I say that superficially now. You know, from my experience in tracking probably 40 blood biomarkers over the past 7 years, things that are well known in published studies to be resistant to intervention, for example, lipoprotein A, aside from things like high-dose niacin therapy, which, anyway, things that have been thought to be not malleable, I find that through regular tracking and attempts at optimization through changing diet, that almost every biomarker is malleable. It's just a matter of having enough data and trying enough interventions and figuring out what it is that actually impacts that biomarker. So for now, superficially, my Horvath epigenetic age is terrible, but it's only a matter of time before I have enough data and I have enough dietary data, supplements, et cetera, you know, fitness lifestyle that correlates with it, and then I can start to try different interventions to bring my Horvath epigenetic age test down. All right, so then I also have a relatively low Hannum epigenetic age, and this is a marker of youthful immune cell aging. And then last but not least, I have a relatively slow Dunedin Pace epigenetic age, so a reduced epigenetic aging rate using that test. All right, so what's contributing to these data? So for that, I'm going to go through supplements, diet composition, and then CV cardiovascular fitness.
So can you back to the last slide?
Yeah.
So can you safely make the comment that using 4 epigenetic clocks, calorie restriction is not significant? So if you don't have patients that are on calorie restriction, then you
For patients or anybody in general that would want to measure their rate of epigenetic change, when considering that none of the other epigenetic clocks are able to detect the epigenetic age reduction as a result of CR, I'd posit that maybe they're just, these other epigenetic clocks may be better predictors of chronological age or all-cause mortality risk, but not necessarily improvements in epigenetic age. So this is one reason why I've so heavily focused on the blood-based biomarkers as my primary strategy, is because things like albumin and the red blood cell distribution width, these are things that have been studied for 50 to 100 years plus, depending on the biomarker. A lot of the epigenetic age stuff, which is it's at the cutting edge and it's hot and it's new, even what aspects of aging that each of these clocks measure isn't ubiquitous. They don't all measure the same thing. Like if you said which hallmarks of aging are each of these clocks measuring, I mean, that's still being discovered, So, and actually, epigenetic changes aren't just methylation. It involves acetylation. So if we're only looking at methylation, are we getting the full story for epigenetic age changes? But I still think if you're going to look at year-to-year changes, I think it's important to look at Dunedin Pace. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, do you have maybe a methylation defect that could explain something like C677 or A1298? Would that influence your epigenetic aging possibly?
Yeah, so I've done, I haven't done full genome sequencing, but I've done 23andMe, and I've looked at some of the SNPs related to methylation status. I didn't see anything of note where that may be the case, but my homocysteine, which is a marker of methylation, has basically doubled over the past 15 years. So it could be lifestyle related. It could be that I don't have any methylation defects, and it could be lifestyle related, and I just haven't yet figured out what it is that affects the Horvath test, for example. But in support of that, knowing that my homocysteine levels were about half of where they are now, well, actually a little bit more than half. If I had a methylation defect, I would have predicted that my homocysteine would probably be higher when I was younger rather than exhibiting an age-related change. So the SNP stuff in terms of having a methylation defect is tough too, because companies like 23andMe will give you a few, but do the few represent really the many, right? Like how many SNPs really are there that can affect methylation status? Is it only a handful, or is it, you've got SNPs that will positively affect methylation status, and you've got SNPs that will negatively affect it? Is it hundreds or thousands? So I tend to focus less on the genetic predispositions. I focus on the biomarkers, trying to optimize that. And if there are some defects, and then I've got to go super physiological for some nutrients or supplements, I find that I can still impact these things. So yeah. All right, so what's contributing to these data? So just in starting with supplements, and I think that most people, when they see or hear about my approach, they probably assume that it's supplement heavy. I mean, there are people in this space like Ray Kurzweil who take hundreds of supplements, which, that's not the case in my situation. So in terms of supplements, and I don't know that I can call it a supplement, it's a prescribed medication. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my mid-20s, atrophic thyroid gland, so I've been taking levothyroxine for probably half my life. And then I do occasionally take melatonin. So for the 42-day period that corresponded to this blood test in August, I took a very small amount of melatonin for 3 nights out of those 42 days. Notice that's in micrograms. That's not milligrams. It's a small bite of 100 or 200 micrograms a night. And then that's it. Usually I take vitamin D because I live in the northern latitude for about 9 months out of the year. But for this test, because it was a summer test, I'd get regular sun exposure, 30 to 35 minutes a session, 2 to 3 times a week. And that's it. No other supplements. No geroprotectors, no senolytics. So those aren't necessary to achieve where my blood test and epigenetic age test data is for now. But maybe that's the argument to use some geroprotectors or senolytics for the Horvath data, so you can look at it both ways. All right, so what about diet? How am I using diet to contribute to these data? So first is, how am I tracking diet? So we see that the blood test was on August 22nd. So how do I link diet with each blood test? So my average daily intake from my last blood test, which was on July 11th, through this blood test, the day before this blood test, corresponds to blood test number 5 in 2022. So let me just detail that a little bit more. So here we're looking at July and August 2022. So I tested test number 4 on July 11th, and then test number 5 on August 22nd. So the 42 days, there are 42 days in between those tests. So every day since 2015, I've weighed all of my food prior to intake, and then I enter those food amounts into an online tracking tool, Chronometer. There are many apps that can be used. I mean, I just use this for convenience. I don't know which one is best, but that's just the one that I've settled on to use since 2015. And then I enter daily Chronometer data into a spreadsheet, and then the average intake for those 42 days, including individual food amounts, macro and micronutrients, corresponds to blood test number 5. So then each blood test has a corresponding average diet composition, and with enough blood tests and enough diet compositions that correspond, or an average dietary composition that corresponds, I can calculate correlations. And then based on those correlations, I alter the dietary intake to optimize blood biomarkers. Now, the question of what's optimal for each of these biomarkers, I've done deep literature reviews for each of these biomarkers that I'm going to show. I'm not going to show it here. It would take way too long, and the data gets way too dry. But in terms of how did these biomarkers change in terms of aging and all-cause mortality risk, I've focused my, the data there in terms of what's optimal. So let's start off by taking a look at individual food amounts for that 42-day period. So I've broken it down just in terms of a list from highest to lowest, highest at the top, ranked, so 1 to 23, lowest being walnuts. And this is half of it. I'm going to show the other half in a minute. So why would these foods be at the top? And I don't have the time to go through the details in this talk, but I covered that in an earlier video. I didn't want to rehash old data. So that's in test number 4. And again, that's on my YouTube channel if anybody's interested. So the primary goal for test number 5, though, when considering that 2022 has been a significant improvement over 2021, was basically maintenance with some small tweaking. So I essentially wanted to reproduce test 4's data in terms of biological age, and keeping the diet as close to that as possible with, again, very small tweaks. So then what was different for this 5th test versus the 4th test? So I had an unintentional change, and this had to do with my berry intake, and you can see that my strawberry intake for test number 4 was 622 grams per day, and it was about half that for test number 5. And the unintentional change was that Costco ran out of the 3-berry mix, it ran out of strawberries, so I had to switch to a 3-berry mix. So accordingly, we see an increase in blackberries and blueberries for test number 5, and a reduction in strawberries. So that was an unintentional change. An intentional change was an increase in sardine intake. So we can see that for test number 4, I averaged 99 grams per day, whereas for test number 5, it was significantly different at, and the p-value there is actually, that can't be right, that's wrong. That's the blackberry and blueberry data, but nonetheless, it was significantly higher by about 15 grams per day. So why did I increase sardine intake for test number 5? So the majority of my B12 intake comes from sardines. And prior to this test, B12 was significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. So why is homocysteine important? So here we're looking at hyperhomocystinemia, which is defined as greater than 15 micromolar, and we'll see why 15 may not be relatively high. It's actually, we'll see more about its importance in a minute. So hyperhomocystinemia is associated with the adverse health and/or function of multiple organ systems, including cardiovascular, brain, eye, the reproductive apparatus in women, the pancreas, bone, and kidney. So homocysteine increases during aging. And we can see that here, plasma levels of homocysteine on the y-axis, and this is from 12-year-olds up to older than 80-year-olds. And we can see that for both men and women, homocysteine values are relatively youth, somewhere around 7 micromolar, whereas in people older than 80, it's around 12 micromolar. So what about older than 80 years, especially considering that I intend on living a lot longer than 80 years? So in this study of centenarians, we can see that the median age of the more than 1,700 people in this study, the median age was 100 years, so technically this is a centenarian-based study. We can see that serum levels of homocysteine were 23, so way higher than the 80-year-olds of having 12 micromolar. So the long story short there is if we live long enough, we may all have elevated homocysteine. So I mentioned that prior to this test, B12 is significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. What's my data? So this is my average B12 intake when compared with homocysteine, and this is over the past 5 years. Homocysteine is another test that isn't on a standard chem panel in the CBC. It's an add-on test, so I didn't start adding it on to almost every test until 2017, so I only have 20 data points. I mean, I say only 20 data points, but I have 20 data points over the past 5 years. And what we can see is a significant correlation between B12 intake with homocysteine, significant inverse correlation. So the higher my B12 intake, the lower homocysteine is. And the majority of that, though, comes from methyl B12 supplementation. So when I've supplemented with methyl B12, we can see that my average homocysteine was 9.4 micromolar. Conversely, without supplementation, close to 12 micromolar. So this seems like an easy fix, right? To further reduce homocysteine, why don't I just supplement with 1,000 micrograms per day of homocysteine and then just call it a day, just whatever that ends up being in terms of lower levels. Well, in my case, a relatively higher B12 intake is significantly correlated with more blood biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So for that, this is a big part of my approach, is looking at those correlations. So here we're going to take a look at correlations for B12 intake with what I've designated as big picture biomarkers. So what are the big picture biomarkers? So they obviously include things like glucose, which in my opinion should be a part of any anti-aging strategy or any strategy intended for longevity. And then it's also got homocysteine, but then we've got 3 markers of kidney function: creatinine, BUN, blood urea nitrogen, uric acid; 3 markers of liver function: alkaline phosphatase, albumin, AST, aspartate aminotransferase; all the major lipoproteins: HDL, LDL, VLDL, lipoprotein A; immune-related components, so neutrophils, lymphocytes, percentage of lymphocytes, monocytes, and then platelets, and then it's not an immune cell, but a total level of globulins, so immunoglobulins. Red blood cell-related measures, including total levels of red blood cells, but also the MCV, the average volume within a red blood cell, and the red blood cell distribution width, RDW, a marker of inflammation, high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, and then the overall biological age score. So there's a couple more bits of information that are on this image. The N next to each blood test is how many blood test data that I have for each variable, so 37 tests for glucose, 21 tests for homocysteine. And then the R is the correlation coefficient, and the p-value is whether it's statistically significant or not, with less than 0.05 being a significant correlation. All right, so then the next question is, what's significantly associated with B12 intake? So first, we can see that significant correlation with homocysteine. So higher levels of B12 are significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. And I think this is an important point to mention, because I find a lot of reductionism, whereas most people will focus on optimizing glucose, or whether it's using a CGM or the lipid panel, and they'll be on a specific diet and they'll say, look at my glucose and look at my lipid panel. But what about kidney function? What about immune cells? What about inflammation? There are many more parameters to measure just besides one thing. So if I only focused on homocysteine, I could just call it a day. I'd just take lots of B12 and never worry about anything else. But that's probably not a good idea, because at least based on this data, a relatively higher B12 intake is significantly correlated with higher glucose, with a higher blood urea nitrogen, with higher levels of alkaline phosphatase, higher levels of neutrophils, higher levels of monocytes, and a lower percentage of lymphocytes. So then the next step would be to determine, are these correlations going in the right or wrong direction in terms of aging and all-cause mortality risk? Just as I mentioned, without going through all of that data in terms of showing it, just to say it, I mean, glucose increases during aging, so relatively higher levels would be a bad thing. So that correlation with B12 is going in the wrong direction. Blood urea nitrogen also increases during aging. Alkaline phosphatase doesn't increase during aging, but relatively higher levels are associated with increased all-cause mortality risk. Neutrophils and monocytes increase during aging, and whereas the percentage of lymphocytes declines during aging. So very clearly, each of these positive correlations with B12 intake are going in the wrong direction in terms of aging and or all-cause mortality risk. So I've given them that red arrow, whereas the green arrow is it's going in the right direction in terms of aging and or all-cause mortality risk. And then there are 3 correlations that are a bit more tricky to decipher. For example, red blood cells and platelets are positively correlated with B12 intake, and both of these decline during aging. Superficially, it would look that having a positive correlation with B12 this is a correlation that would potentially reverse age-related changes. But I find that in my data, having relatively higher levels of platelets, and this is within the 200 to 300 range, which has been shown to be associated with lowest all-cause mortality risk. But then the question is, do I want to be closer to 200? Do I want to be closer to 300? So there's a bit of fine-tuning here. So nonetheless, when I do a biomarker versus biomarker analysis, which is platelets, red blood cells, and even LDL, which was significantly correlated with B12 intake, each of these biomarkers having relatively higher levels is significantly correlated with more of the big picture biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. So I've given them red arrows too. Now, even if I don't give red arrows to the red blood cells, LDL, and platelets, we still have those 6 that I mentioned earlier that are definitely going in the wrong direction. So the net effect would be negative for a relatively higher B12 intake on these big picture biomarkers, at least the ones that were had statistical significance with the p-value less than 0.05. So nonetheless, I've given it a net score of -8, 9 biomarkers not in red and 1 biomarker in green. So what does that mean? How do I decipher that? So if the net score is positive, I would eat above my average intake since 2015, for the data that I have since 2015. If the net score is 0, I aim for my average intake. And if, in this case, the net score is negative, so I would eat below my average intake. So my average B12 intake since 2015 is 542 micrograms per day. But note that, so then one can say, all right, just take in 300 micrograms or 50 micrograms. But note that homocysteine wasn't dramatically reduced at 300 micrograms per day with an average of 10.1. And we're considering that youth is somewhere around 7 micromolar. And we're considering that at relatively higher levels of B12, more blood biomarkers are significantly correlated with going in the wrong direction than right. So I'm out of luck, it looks like, with supplemental B12. So with that in mind, I tried to reduce homocysteine with a smaller intake of B12 by increasing my sardines. Now, you may think 1 microgram increase from sardines versus 300 with supplemental B12. I mean, I didn't know. You wouldn't know until you actually did the experiment. So in my case, homocysteine didn't get reduced with a higher sardine intake, a purposely higher sardine intake, and it's B12. But I do lots of these little experiments to see what hits and what doesn't.
Are you making these R values off those 2 data points, test 4 and 5, or is this multiple?
Right. So remember, since 2015, I have how many blood tests, the little n on the left, for each blood biomarker. So for each test, I have an average dietary intake. And then, so if I have 35 tests, I have 35 data points for diet and for blood tests. So it's correlation, it's never just 2 data points, it's all of the data.
Just out of curiosity, so you're, if you have a higher B12, you're lowering your homocysteine, but being that that's a glutathione chain, did you do any supplementation with glycine or NAC to see if that was if that was a confounder possibly? I'm just curious.
So I wish I could measure, I wish I could measure not total glutathione, but GSH and GSSG. I've yet to find a commercial lab in the US where I can measure both GSH and GSSG. Independent of the homocysteine story. I mean, there's an abundance of data, or maybe not an abundance, but there's an emerging literature on glutathione in randomized controlled trials, in extending positive effects in randomized controlled trials in older adults, extending lifespan in mice, being relatively higher in centenarians, even though glutathione declines during aging. Yeah, I'd love to measure and track and optimize my GSH and GSSG in the ratio, but and total glutathione doesn't really tell me anything because I could have high GSSG and low GSH and my totals look fine though. But
did you use folic acid?
I have supplemented with folic acid and B6. I've tried, and I've documented this in videos on my channel on YouTube, but I've tried TMG, trimethylglycine. I've tried the combination of folic acid, B12, and B6 at the same time. And it all goes into the average dietary composition. So, I am looking at correlations for folate, folate and B6, basically every nutrient with homocysteine. And in my case, even with folate intakes up to, I think, 1,700 micrograms per day, most of that coming from diet, though, not significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. B12 is, of those 4, TMG, folic acid, B6, B12, B12 is the only one that's significantly correlated with lower homocysteine in my data.
This is a little off the topic, sorry. What's your rationale for taking levothyroxine and not like either Armour or some kind of compounded thyroid medicine?
So when I was a grad student in Texas, I actually took T3. And when I came to Boston in 2010, they basically forced me off that. So I'm actually thinking a combination therapy of T4 and T3 may be better because I tend to be low towards on T3.
Well, sure. I mean, why not Armour?
I mean, so I actually measured my, the net effect is what are my levels, right? My T3, free T3, free T4, TSH. So I actually tested that twice in the last 2 weeks. And the first test, my free T3 was relatively low, which suggests a deficit in converting T4 to T3, which goes back to maybe I should be on supplemental T3, which I'm ready to have an argument with my endocrinologist about that, you know, but then I tested, that was with finger prick, but then I tested with venipuncture the next week, and my free T3 and free T4 levels were actually decent. They weren't bad. So whether it's Armour or just taking levothyroxine, I don't know that would be better. I may have a deficit in converting the T4 to T3, so how do you fix that is the bigger issue.
Well, if you don't fix it, you just take Armour, but do you have autoantibodies? Yeah.
That's on my list I didn't when I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism back in the day, but it'd be good to follow up and see.
You want to check your autoantibodies on all these years?
Nope. But I will, though.
You should ditch your endocrinologist and go to a functional medicine doctor.
Yeah, that Tufts is right down the street, so it's just you know, it's an easy thing to go to. But you know, it shouldn't be a war where I have to. It's not like I'm coming at this from just, you know, some schmo off the street who doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, I'm a scientist at Tufts. I've got data and evidence to support my thing, and yet it's still, I feel like I'm barking up a tree, you know. So, but yeah, it's a good point. Someone here had a question. No, she didn't, but I think you had a question, or?
I was just asking about your Hashimoto's, because if you have Hashimoto's, you should really ideally be on, you know, Armour.
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, I don't know how you diagnose Hashimoto's, but I had an atrophic thyroid gland, and I may just not make enough thyroid gland. But anyway, that's, in theory, in terms of these big picture biomarkers, my thyroid status should be on here too. So I have plans to incorporate that data because even though in the past I've tried to optimize my thyroid level hormones without levothyroxine and had no success, I mean, my TSH goes sky high if I'm not supplementing with something. Because that's a condition specific to me, I should still incorporate it. And then I'll probably also include adrenal hormones because, as we'll see, I may have some deficits going on there too. All right, so in terms of rest of the diet, so that's the remaining 45, up to 45 foods, ranked in terms of abundance. So for this test, what was also different was my data intake, and why that's important will become evident in a second. So for this test, it was 12.4 grams, whereas for test number 4, it's 25 grams. So I cut it in part because of that unintended change by Costco with switching the berries. So blackberries and blueberries have a higher fructose content, which higher fructose in my data is bad. You know, bad. It's correlated with more blood biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right, which we'll see in a minute. So to account for that, I adjusted my data intake down to reduce total fructose. But in terms of homocysteine, that may have been a relatively bad idea because, interestingly, a higher data intake is significantly correlated with lower homocysteine in my data. Now, I have a bit less data for tracked food intake. Unfortunately, I didn't have the idea. I've been tracking macros and micros since 2015, but I didn't have the idea to track individual food amounts until somewhere around 2018, 2019. So I have a lot less data for individual foods versus the biomarkers, but nonetheless, I have 13 data points for homocysteine versus my average date intake, which is what we can see here, and we can see a significant inverse correlation. So the higher my date intake, that's significantly correlated with a lower homocysteine. So for this test, for test number 5, my homocysteine was at its highest and data intake was at its lowest. So here too, it would seem like, okay, if dates have some impact on homocysteine, just increase your data intake to your highest level, somewhere in the 35 to 40 gram range per day. But when looking at correlations between dates with the big picture biomarkers, they have a net correlative score of -4, which suggests I should eat below my average intake of 29 grams per day rather than going higher. So for test number 5, I increased it from 12 to 20. Actually, it was 25, right? 25 grams. For test number 6, I should say, I increased it to 26 grams per day. And although I won't go over it in this thing, I've actually reduced homocysteine back down to around 10. Now, why that's also important is because you could say, what if dates were just higher during those periods when I was supplementing with B12? And actually, when I looked at those correlations, that was indeed true. So when my B12 intakes were at their highest through supplementation, my date intakes were at their highest. So if I stopped there and didn't actually do the experiment, I wouldn't see that without B12 in my diet and keeping dates relatively high, I saw homocysteine come down from 12 to 9.7 micromolar on my test on Monday. So for some reason, dates may have an impact, or maybe other stuff in my diet, which I doubt. But this is the strongest correlation for reduced homocysteine in my data, which is date intake. Now, people always ask, though, what, is your diet always clean? What do you do about junk? How do you eat, with other people around you eating junk? So if I do have a cheat meal, what works for me is that it's on the day of, right after the blood test, and then immediately, and then on the day after, and then I shut it down. Literally no junk until the next blood test. So for this test, it was the first 2 days, and then no junk for 40 days until test number 5. And then just to illustrate in terms of amounts, it was Nutella. I mixed it with peanut butter, so it's like homemade Reese's peanut butter cup, and then I had Swedish fish. And then I had to also put the amounts here because someone online saw that I posted the amount in grams per day and thought that I was literally eating, a teaspoon of Nutella a day, which is insanity. Nobody has that kind of discipline. So it was 147 grams over 2 days, Swedish fish, 60 grams in 1 day, and then nothing for 40 days. And that's what works for me. I can't do once a day. I can't do once a week, cheat day, cheat week. I have to have it and then forget about it, and that's what works for me. And then I also chew gum, which is technically junk during my workout. But other than that, it's a clean diet, whole food based, no other junk. All right, so that's the food composition. What about macro and micronutrient composition? Is it high fat? Is it high carb? Is it high protein? Where do we stand there? So this is the calorie, protein, and fat intake that corresponds to test number 5. So starting with calorie intake, I averaged just a bit under 2,300 calories. So why that amount? So when doing the correlation analysis for calorie intake versus the big picture biomarkers, calorie intake in my data has a net correlative score of -5. So that means that 5 biomarkers are going in the wrong direction, and in this case, none are going in the right. So a relatively higher calorie intake is significantly correlated with higher alkaline phosphatase, higher AST, higher LDL, higher platelets, and higher RDW, which are all going in the wrong direction in terms of aging and or all-cause mortality risk. So when the score is negative, that means that suggests I should eat below my average intake. My average calorie intake since 2015 is about 2,550 calories per day. So we can see that the 2294 is below that. So we give it a check mark that I'm following the correlations. And I can't say, with this approach, it's, correlation doesn't equal causation. It's hard to say that, so when I do the correlation analysis, I may get 15 things that are correlated with a given biomarker. So if I only go after the first one, is that first one the big tree in the forest that will really impact the biomarker? Or is it, do I have to follow 10 correlations for a given biomarker to get that biomarker to change? So I think it makes the most sense to follow as many correlations as possible for diet with the blood biomarkers, not just the top hit or the second hit, but as many as possible. So calorie intake, following that so far. Protein intake, 97 grams per day. It's about 70% of my calories. Why that amount? We go to the correlation analysis. Protein intake, a relatively higher protein intake, seems to be bad for me with a net correlative score of -8. This is also an interesting one too, because for some reason a relatively higher protein intake in my data is significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. So if I stopped there and only had reductionism, dietary reductionism, if I only looked at the correlation for protein intake with homocysteine, I'd say just eat a lot of protein, maybe homocysteine comes down. And if I didn't consider all the other biomarkers, I would never know that higher protein intake in my data may be systemically bad, as you can see with the 9 biomarkers going in the wrong direction. So that net 8 minus score suggests I should eat below my average, 112.5 grams per day, so 97 is less than that. We give that a check mark too. All right, so then fat intake for this test, it was 83 grams per day, which is about 33% of my diet. So why that amount? We go to the correlation analysis. So total fat in my data has also a strong negative score, -7. So just to indicate which ones that they're correlated with, I'll put them up there if anyone's interested. So total fat isn't homogeneous. It breaks down into mono and poly and saturated fat. So my average intake for total fat is about 86 grams per day. So the -7 score suggests I should eat below that. So for this test, I was purposely at 83 grams per day. So we give that a check mark because we're following the correlation. All right, then monounsaturated fat. And actually, this is an interesting one because 15 grams per day doesn't seem like a lot, but I increased that for this test that I just did on Monday. And for whatever reason, monounsaturated fat, just from nuts, avocado, net negative score on my data. It's significantly correlated with a lower MCV, but higher levels of glucose and red blood cells. So the net negative score suggests I should eat below the average intake, and we can see 15 is less than the 17, so give it a check. All right, and then in terms of polyunsaturated, we've got omega-3 and omega-6. So now actually we see, if I only focused on total fat and didn't look at the individual fat distributions, I would miss that omega-3 and, as we'll see, omega-6 actually have net positive scores in my data. So omega-3, score of +3, that suggests I should eat above my average intake of 7 grams per day. So 8 is higher than 7, so I'm following that correlation. So I'm actually going to increase this more for my next test, or test number 7 this year, and see how it impacts the biomarkers. Omega-6 also net score of +3, and again, this isn't based on seed oil-based food sources. This is whole food based. So score of +3 suggests that I should be above my average intake. 16 is greater than 15.5, following the correlation. Saturated fat has a score of -6 in my data. So 23 is less than 27. I'm following that correlation too. Now, interesting thing about saturated fat is most of this may be driven by dairy saturated fatty acids. So for whatever reason in my data, cheese and full-fat yogurt, more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right, whereas saturated fat, from whether it's fish or coconut butter, cocoa beans don't have a similar correlation profile to the dairy, correlation profile. So I may actually raise the saturated fatty acids that are not from dairy and see how that goes and see how the correlations change if they do over time. And then last on this list, but not least, total cholesterol has a very strong negative score on my data, which suggests I should eat below my average intake of 126 milligrams per day. So 24 is less than that, so I'm following the correlation. And I'll have more on cholesterol in a few slides. So based on the checks, I'm 6 for 6 in following the correlations for fat intake with the big picture biomarkers. And as I mentioned, that's important because I don't know which of these, if any of these on their own, can independently affect the biomarkers. So by following as many correlations as possible, I would expect the best blood biomarker profile to result. All right, so what about carbohydrate intake? So for test number 5, it was about 50% of my total diet. So why that amount? We go to the correlation analysis, and we can see that net carbs have a net score of +1, which suggests I should eat above my average intake of 234 grams per day. So I was above that, so we give that a check. And then fiber has a score of +1, 2. So that suggests I should eat above my average intake, which is 97 grams per day. So here is where there's actually an X. So 91, I can go higher for fiber, but then it starts to increase, it starts to alter other biomarkers. And something about this approach that I want to highlight too is a score of +1, is it going to impact the biomarkers as much as a score of -8, like protein intake or saturated fat -6? So even though I'm not following this correlation, by having 10 more grams of fiber per day, I wonder how much the ones, +1s, and 0s affect the biomarkers relative to the big hits like protein intake or total fat intake with a score of -7. And then I mentioned total fructose intake earlier, which I track. Of sugar intake, I track the fructose intake because my diet is rich in fruits and vegetables. So I tend to eat a lot of fructose, and I could eat pounds of fruit every day. But we can see by a score of -3 that may not be good for my blood biomarkers. So that suggests I should eat below my average, which is 85 grams per day. So 65 is less than 85, so we give that a check. So what about micronutrients? And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to highlight a few key vitamins and minerals. So first, we'll have a look at niacin, which has a very positive score in my data of +7. So I should eat above my average intake based on the rules that I've set for positive, negative, and 0 scores. So 42 is higher than 36, so we give that a check. Now, the RDA, this approach also goes to beyond the RDA, what's optimal? So it's easy to just meet the RDA, but what's optimal at the individual level, not just for macros, macronutrients, but also for micronutrients. And using this approach, I see the data that, like I said, beyond the RDA, we can address what's optimal. So just to illustrate that, the RDA for niacin is 16 milligrams per day. So I'm 2.5-fold higher than the RDA there, and with a score of +7, that would suggest that that's net positive. In contrast, we saw that B12 correlation of -8. So there aren't hard and fast rules where if you go 2 times higher than the RDA or 4 times higher than the RDA or 10 times or whatever, we can see that going higher as 542, that's bad for my data. So again, this approach can get close to that that question of beyond the RDA, what's optimal. And then another one I want to highlight is beta carotene, which also goes to the idea of reductionism. So when I first started this journey, if anybody goes to my YouTube channel and sees my videos on albumin, which is the most abundant protein in blood, which illustrates its importance for tracking it and making sure it doesn't decline during aging. Beta carotene has almost always been strongly correlated with relatively higher albumin in my data. But in my early days of this approach, I only looked at one correlation at a time basically and didn't consider the other biomarkers. So if I did that, I would miss that beta carotene has a very strong negative score in my data. It is significantly correlated with higher albumin, but it's significantly correlated with 9 other biomarkers going the wrong direction than right. So that suggests I should eat below my average intake, which is 54,000 micrograms per day, or about 54 milligrams per day. So 50 milligrams per day is less than 54 milligrams per day, so I'm following the correlations. So just to highlight a few more, vitamin D, 300 IUs per day. That's below the RDA, but this was a summertime blood test, so I was getting regular sun exposure. And then if that was low, we'd expect to see it reflected in my blood test data. So I used an at-home blood testing company, and over 10 blood tests, my 25-hydroxy-D was about 64 nanograms per mil, which is a lot higher than what's been published. 30 nanograms per milliliter is defined as deficient, so I'm far from being deficient with no vitamin D supplementation and my regular sun exposure in the summer. So I'm not too worried about my dietary intake of 300 being below the RDA of 600. And then another one I'd like to illustrate is vitamin K. So we can see almost 2,000 micrograms per day, which is the +2 score suggests I should eat above my average of 1564. So that gets a check, 1955, higher than 1564. Now, the RDA, or an AI for vitamin K, is only 120 micrograms per day. So here we can see that I'm 16 times higher than the what's defined as an adequate intake, but yet it has a net overall positive correlative score of +2. So if 16 times the RDA was too much, I'd expect to see more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right, using vitamin B12, as shown earlier as an example. And then a few more. So minerals, copper, scores +3. That suggests I should be above my average intake of 4.3 milligrams per day. 4.7 is above that, so we give it a check. And for RDA, note that the RDA for copper is 0.9 milligrams per day. So here I'm 5 times higher. Again, no hard and fast rules for how high or how much above the RDA that one should go, but this is a data-driven approach to figure out what may be optimal at the individual level. And then another one I'd like to highlight is magnesium. So net score of 0. That suggests I should eat right at my average intake of 800 milligrams per day, which I'm not. I'm about 700. But that is higher than the RDA. So, but this, again, goes to my point of, for the scores that are 0, -1, +1, if you're close to the average, is that going to impact the biomarkers as being, if this was 300, it would probably be a problem. So I tend to focus most on the biomarkers, on the scores that have the very most positive and very most negative, and I'd expect the most positive, most negative to most impact the biomarkers. All right, so this is the diet section. So what about fitness? And I'm not going to go over my usual workouts, but another aspect of including strength training and mobility and balance and all of that is important. It's a huge part of my approach, but I'm going to focus on the more objective metrics like cardiovascular fitness metrics, including resting heart rate and heart rate variability. So as I mentioned earlier, if we track and optimize biomarkers of organ and systemic health, can aging be slowed? And then what should we track? So in a recently published preprint, this was pretty well covered. And I also mentioned earlier that most people I find only focus on health and only focus on metabolic markers, including glucose and lipids. And then many of the biomarkers that are in my big picture, on my big picture list are included on those 2 biological age calculators, including PhenoAge and Aging.ai, including the immune cells, liver markers, kidney markers, so creatinine is one of them, so you can assess EGFR. But then notice there are other organ systems that are missing, and I think it's easy to focus on the biological age test, but the biological age test, whether blood-based or epigenetic, may have blind spots, and I don't want to get to an advanced age and only focus on the biomarkers that are on these biological age tests, and then realize some adverse health condition because I just didn't track all of the organ systems. I only tracked a few. So, for example, musculoskeletal measures are not on the biological age test. And note that leanness and fitness are a big part of my approach, so I'm not skipping out on that. But until relatively recently, I wasn't addressing pulmonary function, so I bought a spirometer, so I'm regularly tracking my forced expiratory volume in 1 second now, so I can work on optimizing that over time. Brain-based biomarkers are not on any of the tests that I mentioned. And that's a tough one to track because there aren't any commercially available blood-based biomarkers that are good for predicting brain health. MRIs are probably the best thing you can get, but I think it's going to be hard to convince my doctors to let me get a brain MRI 6 or 7 times a year. And then last but not least, cardiovascular metrics are not on these blood-based biomarker tests. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the data for resting heart rate and heart rate variability. So first, how does the resting heart rate change during aging? So this is Whoop data. I mean, that's what I wear. I'm not sponsored by them. There are many companies that are doing this. All of them mostly reliable to detect resting heart rate and heart rate variability. So using Whoop's own data, resting heart rate increases during aging from the 20 to 50-year age range for both men and women, so men in blue and women in red. So you can see those age-related increases there. So that's from 20 to 50 years. What about older than 50 years? So this is Fitbit data, average resting heart rate on the y-axis plotted against age. And just like the Whoop data, we can see that resting heart rate does indeed increase up to 50 years of age. But then notice that after 50, we then see a decrease for resting heart rate. And this is in a study of 92,000 people, so it's a relatively large study. So resting heart rate increases, then decreases during aging. So note that a relatively low resting heart rate is found in both young and people of advanced age. So then how would you know if your relatively low heart rate or resting heart rate was indicative of youth or aging? So that's where heart rate variability comes in. That can provide more context. So what is the heart rate variability? So the standard definition is that it's the variability for the time in between heartbeats. So for a heart rate of 60 beats per second, the assumption is that the heart beats exactly once per second, but that's not necessarily true. So here we can see the time in between 3 different heartbeats, and the time in between those heartbeats is different in this simplified cartoon, which would result in a heart rate variability of 67 milliseconds. So this is using the root mean squared of successive differences, RMSSD. There are many different measures of heart rate variability, but this is the one that Whoop provides, and this is the one that I'll be showing data for today. So how does heart rate variability change during aging? So we can see that here. So we've got the RMSSD on the y-axis, again, heart rate variability, plotted against age, 20 to 60 years. And then we've got 2 different curves here. So the top curve is testing at 6 in the morning, and that's when Whoop does it automatically, last sleep cycle, so it's pretty close to 6 a.m. So that's the data I'm going to go through today. But then also notice the dashed lines. This is heart rate variability for 6 o'clock at night. So taking your heart rate variability in the morning is clearly higher at every time point than taking it at night. Nonetheless, we see that heart rate variability declines during aging from values that are about 75 approaching 80 in 20-year-olds to less than half of that in 60-year-olds. But what about older than 60-year-olds? So note that this study was very large. This was 8.2 million Fitbit users. So once we get past 60 years, the studies on age-related trends for heart rate variability get few and far between, and dramatically smaller in terms of sample size. This is a few hundred subjects here with the sample size. Nonetheless, when looking at from 10-year-olds up to 79-year-olds, we can see that heart rate variability does indeed decline from values of 53 milliseconds to around 19 milliseconds in the 70 to 79-year-old group. But interestingly, the 20, 80 to 99-year-olds in this study, we can see that their heart rate variability was higher than expected based on chronological age, which then suggests that higher heart rate variability than expected based on chronological age may be a marker of longevity. So I'm not saying that based on one study, there's more data. So let's look at data for people older than 99 years for heart rate variability. And there's only one study that I know of that's actually looked into this, so this is far from being a definitive truth. A lot more studies are needed. This is just a suggestion which may be possible. So for the centenarians in this study, it was only 17 people too, but they had an average age of 102 years. We can see that their median heart rate variability, again, RMSSD, was 36 milliseconds, which was significantly higher than the 84-year-olds in this group of 24 milliseconds, but not as good, obviously, as the young adults of about 58 milliseconds. So when considering these two studies of people older than 80, having a higher than expected heart rate variability than expected based on their chronological age may be a marker of longevity. So to address that question, the earlier question, is a relatively low resting heart rate indicative of youth or aging? Now we can address that question. We can help answer it. So at younger ages, we see lower resting heart rates, but high heart rate variabilities. And at advanced ages, even though this goes up to 60, I mean, in theory, this should be up to 80. At advanced age, we see also low resting heart rates, but low heart rate variabilities. And then if one could make the argument, but what about the 80-year-olds and centenarians that had higher than expected? It's still lower than what you would find in someone that's 20 years old. Now, I've tracked both of these cardiovascular metrics since 2018, so I have 1,500 days of data. So what does my data look like? Now, just going on the population-based averages, we'd expect that my resting heart rate should be increasing and my heart rate variability should be decreasing. So is that true? So this is my data for resting heart rate. Again, this is 1,500 days of data over the past 4 years. So I'm going to break it down year by year. So when I first started tracking, my average resting heart rate was about 51 beats per minute. And I've never been sedentary at any point during this process. In 2018, I was actually probably more active than I am now. Walking 15 to 20 miles a week, doing regular strength training, weightlifting, I mean, up to 3 hours a session once or twice a week. So, but as we'll see, I was chronically overtrained, at least based on cardiovascular fitness metrics. So then I changed my approach, how often I was training, how often I was exercising, getting more rest days in, and I started to slowly reduce my resting heart rate over time. So in 2019, it was 48.9, down from 50.9. And then just rather than looking at the averages, we can compare these two groups of data with a 2-sample t-test, but I'll show that in a second. So 2020 and 2021, I further reduced resting heart rate, 48.1, 47.4. That's the yearly average, and each data point is a single day's worth of data. All right, so what about in 2022? So far in 2022, and this is up through last month, September 18th, my average for the year for 2022 is about 45 beats per minute. And then we can see which of these values are statistically different or not using a 2-sample t-test, so comparing 2 years at a time. So we can see that I've significantly reduced my resting heart rate when compared with 2018 for each of the years. So 2019 versus 2018 and going forward, we can see that the p-values are significant so in other words, each of these values is significantly lower than where I started. And then also I've significantly reduced resting heart rate year over year, YOY, every year too, since 2018. So it isn't just 2019 versus 2018, but 2020 is lower than that, 2021 lower than 2020, and 2022 lower than 2021. So consistently, I've reduced my resting heart rate over this 4-year period. But is that good or bad? Because if you remember, a lower resting heart rate can be found in youth, but also in advanced age. So am I just on this slope where my cardiovascular fitness is just getting worse with time? So I guess the good news is that I've resisted that age-related increase for resting heart rate, but I still don't know yet. We still don't know if I'm on this track. So how can we assess that? So we can by having a look at heart rate variability since 2018. So over that same time period of about 1,500 days of data, so I started with a heart rate variability of 47 milliseconds in 2018, and then significantly increased that to 56 milliseconds in 2019, and then increased it again in 2020 to 57.8. Well, increased it when compared with 2018, but not significantly increased when compared with 2019. So both of these years essentially the same in terms of heart rate variability. But
what did you do at the end of 2019?
Yeah, I don't want to say that it was. I don't want to say that it's the device, because then that throws into question all of my data. But I've never had. You see here, like I didn't do anything different. Whoop has updated its algorithm a few times, and I don't know if it just if it was a glitch in their software. But then again, raising that issue makes me think can kind of throw down on all of the data. I didn't do anything different, but these random spots. Actually, now that I think about it some more, my diet back then was not it wasn't as consistent as it's been now. So I'd have days where it was kind of an every other day fasting approach, where I'd eat 5,000 calories and then like 500 calories the next day. So by having 500 calories, that may have shot my heart rate variability way up, but I haven't done. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look and see if that was actually true. I'll send you a thing. I'll look up what I did on those days if there's anything that I did that was different. But yeah. All right. So 2020 and 2019 better than 2018 for heart rate variability, and then I had a regression in 2021. So we can see that my heart rate variability went down to about 52 milliseconds. And that was significantly worse when compared with 2020. So year over year worse, but still better than where I started in 2018. So a big focus for 2022 was to get my heart rate variability back on track to resist any potential age-related decline. And we can see in 2022 that I've reversed that 2021 trend with my average now at 59.4 milliseconds, which is better than where I started in 2018 and also significantly better in where it was in 2021. So the story for heart rate variability isn't as consistently improved or reduced as for resting heart rate, but I've increased it relative to where I started from in 2018. So how do these data compare with age-related changes? So my expected heart rate variability based on my chronological age is about 35 milliseconds. So where the data was up until September of this year, at worst, 59 milliseconds is at the high end of the heart rate variability range for my chronological age. But at best, it could be the median heart rate variability for someone with that's 22 years younger. So is this contributing to my blood-based biological age data? I don't know, but it's potentially good news. All right, so then to help answer that question, is the relatively low resting heart rate indicative of youth or aging? Now that we've seen my heart rate variability data, we can answer that question. So in my case, a relatively high heart rate variability plus a low resting heart rate suggests CV youth, whereas what would be expected based on my chronological age would be 35 for heart rate variability and a higher resting heart rate. So the cardiovascular fitness metrics look good. So what's contributing to these improvements? How have I consistently reduced resting heart rate while having some improvements for heart rate variability? So the first for me, and arguably the largest impact, may be body weight. So in addition to all the things I track, I weigh myself every day in the morning. Also, after using the bathroom. So when I first started tracking body weight, I was around 159. And these are not unintentional changes. Like my goal is always to be as lean as possible. So measuring body weight helps with that approach. So I'm currently around 151, 152, and we can see the ups and downs. This is the average monthly body weight. So each dot is the average for a month. It's not stable. It's we've had some ups and downs there. So how does body weight relate to resting heart rate? So when plotting the resting heart rate, the average monthly resting heart rate, the plots kind of look the same. And interestingly, as body weight decreases, my resting heart rate correspondingly decreases during those periods too. And conversely, during periods where my body weight has increased, resting heart rate has also increased. Now, besides looking at trends in data, we can compare to see if they are significantly correlated. And that's what we've got here. This is the daily resting heart rate. So each dot is a single day's worth of data versus body weight. And this is over that same 4+ year period, 1,500 days. And here we can see a significant correlation. So as body weight is higher, that's significantly correlated with a higher resting heart rate. You can see a highly significant p-value there. And conversely, as my body weight has gotten closer to 150 pounds, I've gotten closer to resting heart rates that are approaching 45 beats per minute. So what about heart rate variability? So the data for heart rate variability and how it relates to body weight isn't as clear-cut as the resting heart rate. For example, as body weight has decreased, as shown there with flatter lines, there are increases for heart rate variability. And conversely, as body weight has increased, there are decreases for heart rate variability. And more specifically, in looking at the correlations for now the daily heart rate variability versus body weight, again, that 4-year period, 1,500 days of data. Each dot is a single day's worth of data, whereas here it's the average monthly data. We see a significant inverse correlation. So as my body weight has increased, that's significantly correlated with worse heart rate variability. And conversely, as my body weight has approached 150 pounds, my heart rate variability has approached the relatively youthful values of 60 milliseconds. So I'm currently around here. So that makes the most sense for the link between body weight and my relatively recently high heart rate variability. So in terms of that question, what's the relationship for body weight with these cardiovascular fitness metrics? They both approach youthful values as body weight decreases. In my case, it may be different for others, but this is what my data shows. Now, the other obvious one here is how does physical activity, how does exercise, because if you exercise, you're going to improve cardiovascular fitness. That should impact your heart rate variability and resting heart rate. So how does that factor in here? So for that, I'm going to show data on the average daily heart rate, which I've designated the ADHR. And that's an index of physical activity. So why the importance of this metric? So I find that a lot of people track steps, but the heart rate for walking 1,000 steps on flat ground is going to be less than the heart rate for 1,000 steps walking up a hill. So if you only track steps and not heart rate, you're going to miss that. Whereas by tracking the average daily heart rate, that's going to be a measure of your overall heart's exertion during the day. And we could even make it more specific by multiplying body weight times your average daily heart rate as a measure of overall work that your heart has performed, but that's an analysis for another day. So a higher average daily heart rate would be more physical activity plus overall stress. It isn't just physical activity that affects your average daily heart rate. I mean, I've had days, unfortunately, we all do, where there's some kind of stressor, whether it's work or whatever, and heart rate is elevated more than usual for the day, sympathetic activation. So you can have a relatively high average daily heart rate and just sitting in a chair. So I try to minimize that as much as possible, but it's something we all can't avoid. All right, so what's the correlation for the average daily heart rate with the next day resting heart rate? So we can see that here. And unfortunately, I didn't start tracking this when I first started tracking all of the other metrics, but this is 900 days of data for the resting heart rate versus the average daily, next day resting heart rate versus the average daily heart rate for the day before. And what we can see is that there's a significant correlation. So the higher my average daily heart rate, the worse or higher my resting heart rate the next day. So that suggests that too much daily activity and too often is going to be bad for the resting heart rate. So what about this correlation for average daily heart rate with next morning heart rate variability? And we can see that here. So here the data is that the higher the average daily heart rate, the worse or lower that heart rate variability will be. So average daily heart rate, as that gets higher, heart rate variability is lower. So there too, we see that too much daily activity too often will be bad for heart rate variability. So then the easy answer is finding that balance between activity and rest is important for optimizing resting heart rate and heart rate variability. So what that means for me in the real world setting, so this is a screenshot of 1 week's worth of data for my average daily heart rate. And the active days include my usual workout, which is an 80-minute workout, without going into all those details. And then So after, for example, after the 59, which included my usual workout, I purposefully keep my activity levels relatively low for the next 3 days after. Now, that doesn't mean sedentary. It just means trying to keep overall activity lower than where it was on my workout days. So that's a 4-day cycle, essentially, for workouts. So workout, 3 days off, my workout, full body workout again. But I try to stick to a 3-day cycle. And ideally, it's workout and then titrate lower, hit it hard again. So that's what I find works best for me. I switched to a 4-day when too much other life stress and work stress and overall physical activity gets in the way. And then so I'll have suboptimal cardiovascular fitness metrics. So by taking that extra day of rest, it helps them recover so that when I do a workout, I don't kill my metrics basically chronically. All right, so what about weaknesses in my data? I mean, I don't want to make this seem like it's all gold stars and that there aren't areas to improve. So 2 of those may include DHEA sulfate and the oral microbiome. So to address are there weaknesses in my data, let's highlight a total cholesterol of 133 milligrams per deciliter. So what's optimal for total cholesterol? Hang on. So here we're looking at all-cause mortality data for total cholesterol, all-cause mortality there on the y-axis plotted against total cholesterol on the x. And this is in a study of 45 to 54-year-olds. The age range isn't perfectly overlapping. I mean, this is in the supplementary data, so technically it's 44 to 55-year-olds. But it's data for more than 3.3 million subjects. And what we can see is that when compared with the referent, which was 220 to 229, my 133 for total cholesterol on test number 5 would put me at a more than 2-fold increased all-cause mortality risk. So obviously, superficially, that's not good. So what about age-related changes? How does total cholesterol change during aging? So low total cholesterol is found in youth, as shown there, and then it peaks in about midlife, approximately there, for both men and women. I should say men in green and the women in red. But then if we extrapolate the curves out beyond this age range goes up to 88 years. If we extrapolate out to older than that, centenarian data shows that they also have relatively low levels of total cholesterol, as shown there. So we've kind of got this story again with, how can we know if low total cholesterol is reflective of youth or aging? So low total cholesterol within the context of other youthful biomarkers is associated with decreased all-cause mortality risk, and that's what I'm going to go through here. So relative risk for all-cause mortality, and then this is people who had low total cholesterol, so less than 160, and then varying levels of albumin, ALB, and HDL cholesterol. So note that this is, unfortunately, almost all of the studies on all-cause mortality for cholesterol do not adjust their models for malnutrition, with albumin being one factor involved in that. So whether this is the larger story that's just less widely studied or just an anomaly, there's no way to know. But in this relatively small study of about 400 people, this is what the data shows. So when compared with that hazard ratio of 1, again, I mentioned this earlier, when that confidence interval is completely below, we have statistical significance. And when it overlaps, it's not significant. So the highest all-cause mortality risk in this study was low total cholesterol, low albumin, so less than 38, and low HDL, less than 47. And then what if you had higher HDL in the context of those other biomarkers? So higher HDL did not impact all-cause mortality risk when there was low total cholesterol and low albumin. So what about if albumin levels were relatively high? So in this case, higher than 38 grams per deciliter. And I've designated this as the close to youthful phenotype. And that's because low total cholesterol is found in youth. Relatively high albumin is also found in youth. So for someone to have an albumin of 48 is going to be a low probability for someone that's at advanced age, whereas 48 is what's found in youth. So having low total cholesterol and relatively high albumin is the close to youthful phenotype. And what we can see is that relative to someone who has low total cholesterol, low albumin, low HDL, those people had a 32% decreased all-cause mortality risk. So then it gets a little better. For those who had relatively high albumin and relatively high HDL, which HDL also declines during aging. So low total cholesterol, high albumin, high HDL would be variables you'd be expected to find more often than not, or with a higher probability in younger people relative to older people. And in that case, that would be the youthful phenotype, and we see a 62% decreased all-cause mortality risk for that group. So how does this combination compare then with the higher total cholesterol? If you remember, we've got that 220 to 229 range for lowest all-cause mortality risk. And that was actually compared in this study, all-cause mortality risk on the y-axis, plotted against about a 6-year follow-up. And then we've got those 3 different groups for cholesterol, relatively high, intermediate, and then less than 160, but the youthful phenotype, relatively high albumin and relatively high HDL. And now the mortality curves are overlapping. They were not significantly different. So what that basically summarizes is that someone who's got very low total cholesterol like me, it doesn't have to be an increased all-cause mortality risk. The key may be, again, this isn't settled science. There need to be a bunch more studies on this. The key may be having, the youthful phenotype, which would be relatively high albumin. And my HDL isn't there yet, but 44 isn't too far away from the 47 in this study. So accordingly, I'm not worried about total cholesterol being a weakness in my data, but I do have relatively low levels of DHEA sulfate, as shown there on the August test. Now, note that DHEA sulfate is the most abundant circulating steroid in people, just to highlight its importance without going into all of the pathways and mechanisms that it's involved in. Now, if I only focused on the reference range, I'd miss this as a potential weakness in my data. That reference range is very wide, 61 to 442 micrograms per deciliter. So DHEA sulfate levels decline during aging. We can see that here they peak at around 20 years old, and then they decline. Now, putting my data into this chart, we can see that I'd be relatively low for my age group and actually low for every age group based on this most recent data. Now, I do have earlier data going back to 2005. I measured it twice 17 years ago, and back then it was 300 micrograms per deciliter. So I have experienced a decline. Now, whether that's an age-related decline or it's a deficiency in my diet somewhere, that'll be to be determined. Now, having a DHEA sulfate level where mine currently is associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. So we've got all-cause mortality risk there on the y-axis, and this was a 27-year follow-up. So for people that had DHEA sulfate levels that were less than 129, increased all-cause mortality risk when compared with relatively youthful levels, which were higher than 200 in this study. So one could make the argument it's just one test. Test more often for DHEA sulfate and see where your data is, and maybe it's not actually low. But so to address that, I used at-home blood testing, which I think is going to be the future of health optimization. And that's because you can collect a relatively large amount of data in a short period of time. So even with my 6 to 7 or 8 blood tests per year, which is a lot more than most people do, I could get 6 to 8 tests worth of data in 2 weeks if I could do it by finger prick, rather than 1 year. So with that in mind, I blood tested 12 times using finger prick within 2 months, and I used this company here as their mission is to radically increase human lifespan. So what's my data? So here are those 12 blood tests from July to August of this year. And we can see that my average DHEA sulfate by finger prick was about 120 micrograms per deciliter, which is right in the ballpark of my 129 for the August test. So then the question is, how will I increase it? How will I essentially reverse the age-related trend, if it is an age-related trend, and get it back to where I had it when in youth? So if you remember, I started the story with cholesterol. So what does cholesterol have to do with DHEA sulfate? So DHEA sulfate is produced by cholesterol degradation, as shown here. So cholesterol is degraded to pregnenolone, and these are enzymatic reactions that happen in the adrenal glands, which I'm sure everybody here knows, located on top of the kidney. So cholesterol is degraded to pregnenolone, which is hydroxylated to 17-hydroxypregnenolone, which is then converted into DHEA, which is then converted into DHEA sulfate. So 4 enzymatic steps, cholesterol to DHEA sulfate. Now, if the relatively low DHEA sulfate was because of my relatively low dietary cholesterol and correspondingly low total cholesterol in blood, I'd expect that cortisol and testosterone would also be low. And that's because cortisol is produced by the degradation of pregnenolone, as shown there, and then testosterone is produced by the degradation of DHEA sulfate, as shown there. So what's my data? So for that, we go back to the 12 blood tests using the at-home finger prick blood testing. We'll start with cortisol. And just to note, cortisol, it's a bit debatable on age-related changes. In this study of about 4,800 people, there is a small but significant increase in cortisol during aging. Nonetheless, mine were pretty much midpoint. I mean, nothing spectacular there. but I did have earlier data that was a bit higher. Now, what's optimal for cortisol? That also is a bit debatable. I mean, all-cause mortality data there isn't a definitive story there. It goes both ways. So it may not be a good biomarker in terms of chronological age and all-cause mortality risk. Nonetheless, I do have a decline there, which suggests that adds support to this hypothesis that maybe it's a limitation of dietary and total cholesterol. So what about testosterone? So over those same 12 blood tests, we're putting my average data of 19.4 nanomolars into context. And actually, before that, testosterone follows the same story as DHEA sulfate, increases, peaks in about youth, 20 years old, and then declines. So my data there isn't actually low at all. It is lower than where it was on one test in 2005, which suggests that maybe I do have some age-related change going on for adrenal function, which is why that suggested it there. So when considering that these hormones are produced by degradation of cholesterol, the first step would be, in my opinion, to increase cholesterol with the intention of increasing my DHEA sulfate. So how can I do that? How can I increase blood levels of cholesterol? So for that, I go to the correlations between diet with my blood biomarkers. And in my case, the nutrient that is most strongly correlated with blood levels of cholesterol is indeed dietary cholesterol. Now, I know that there are plenty of published studies saying that dietary cholesterol doesn't impact blood levels of cholesterol. And as we'll see in a minute, that may actually be true. This may actually be correlation and not causation. But in terms of my own data, the strongest correlation is for dietary cholesterol impacting or being correlated with at least blood levels of cholesterol. So for test number 5 in 2022, I had my lowest intake of dietary cholesterol, or around there, 24 milligrams per day. So I had some room to increase it. So, but then as I mentioned earlier, if I increase my dietary cholesterol, and considering it has a score of -8, as shown here, without going through all of that again, but the score is -8, will I improve my total cholesterol level but make a whole bunch of other biomarkers worse? So when the score is -8, that suggests I should eat above my average intake. My average dietary cholesterol intake is 126 milligrams per day. So when considering I was at 24 milligrams per day for dietary intake, I've got some wiggle room there where I can still stick to these rules for the correlations without going too high and messing potentially a whole bunch of other biomarkers up. So I started that approach, and I started to increase my cholesterol intake, not too high though, so 92 milligrams per day, with the goal of potentially increasing blood cholesterol and increasing DHEA sulfate, but not messing up anything else. And without going through that in this video, I posted that video on my YouTube channel a while back. With 4 days of data with a relatively higher dietary cholesterol, so basically 9-fold higher. I mean, this is my average intake here. The next day for DHEA sulfate, it didn't increase. So the long story short there is I increased dietary cholesterol. I didn't see a change in DHEA sulfate. But just to add a little bit more depth there, as I was saying about this correlation with dietary cholesterol with blood cholesterol, a higher dietary cholesterol, up to 220 milligrams per day, didn't actually increase my blood cholesterol. So that I didn't see an effect for dietary cholesterol intake on DHEA sulfate. It may not be settled there because I wasn't actually able to increase my total levels of cholesterol. So nonetheless, I'm going to have to go through some other means to try to figure out how to increase my DHEA sulfate, at least for now, that don't involve dietary cholesterol intake. So what about the oral microbiome? Is that a weakness too? So oral bacteria, and I mentioned that because it's not on the blood-based biomarkers. What if changes in the mouth can precede changes that happen in blood? And if I'm not paying attention to oral health, whether it's through gum inflammation or cavity risk or periodontitis, if I'm not paying attention to that, maybe it'll crop up with advanced age, and then the systemic biomarkers will start to get worse. So to help check that box and avoid that from happening, tracking my oral microbiome is now in the approach. And that's because oral bacteria have been linked with multiple adverse health conditions, as shown there. So beyond stuff in the mouth, like involved with cavity formation or dental root infections, periodontal disease, oral bacteria have also been linked with atherosclerotic plaques, pneumonia, rheumatoid arthritis, and then autoimmune conditions like Sjogren's syndrome and lupus. So how can we optimize oral bacterial composition? So the first step is quantification, and I used a company, Bristol, as shown there. So just going through my overall bacterial composition, I decided to post the full stuff there if anyone's interested in how it breaks down. This is 98.3% of it. 1.7% didn't fit on the slide. So then we're going from in relative abundance, so highest amount at the top and then lowest all the way here at the bottom. So are any of these bacteria linked with oral and or systemic health? So the first start is what's associated with oral health. So what's been shown to be associated with oral health are two genera, Neisseria and Rothia, as shown there, green arrows. And when I sum those data, I've got about half, 53%, and this is my first oral microbiome test. I won't have the time to go into test number 2, but this was the data for my first test. So about half of my oral microbiome has 53% quote-unquote good oral health related bacteria. Now, is 53% optimal? I mean, this is like a huge black box right now in the field. You know, most of the microbiome science is in the gut. Very little of it is in, the oral microbiome, especially even less, published studies on RCTs that can improve oral microbiome composition. So, yeah, my eyes are on that field to see what it will have to say about, what's an optimal amount for both of these levels. Is 53% sufficient? Should it be 60? Should it be 45? Stay tuned for that. So how does my oral bacterial composition compare with bacteria that have been linked with oral and systemic health? So we can go back here. So in terms of cavity formation, the good news is I don't have any Streptococcus mutans in my data, or in fact any bacterium that are related to cavity formation. So the question then is why? So I use a homemade mouthwash, commercially available mouthwashes. I won't name names, but many of them have pHs that are higher than, or actually lower than 5.5, which we'll see is the critical value for cavity formation. So with that in mind, I make a homemade mouthwash that contains xylitol. So how much xylitol do I put in there? So growth of one of the cavity forming, or that's been shown, one of the bacteria that's been shown to form, be related to cavity formation, Streptococcus mutans. Growth of that bacterium is limited in the presence of 1% xylitol, which is what we can see here. So we're looking at log growth right here. So higher levels would be higher levels of the bacterium, lower levels of the bacterium. So when compared with controls, going higher levels of xylitol, we can see lower levels of bacterial growth. So such that with the largest amount of xylitol, 1%, as shown there, actually 1% here would be, that's the log growth there. So that's a 76% reduction for this bacterium in the presence of 1% xylitol. So this is just one strain of Streptococcus mutans. There are many other strains of that bacterium. So just to show that xylitol is efficacious against those other strains of the same bacterium, that's what I'm showing here. Those are the strains, starting with the strain I just showed. So 76% reduction in the presence of 1% xylitol, but then also pretty good reduction with these other strains of the same bacterium. So 61 to 76% by having 1% xylitol in the mouthwash. So with these data in mind, I include 1 gram of xylitol per 100 mils of water in the homemade mouthwash. So what else is in that mouthwash? So to illustrate what else is in it, let's go through oral acidity and how it contributes to tooth decay. So we're looking at plaque pH there. And then time after a glucose rinse at time 0. So for the person who has active cavity formation, after the glucose rinse, their oral pH rapidly declines to that below the critical pH of 5.5, where this is now where there's a higher risk for cavity formation when it's below that. So for the person who has caries active going on, they rapidly decline to below 5.5, and you can see by the red area under the curve, they stay there for a long time too. So they have a slow recovery to get out of the caries active zone. For someone that has inactive cavity formation, the oral pH after the glucose rinse goes below 5.5, but relatively rapidly gets out of that region pretty fast. And then for the person who's caries resistant, even after the glucose rinse, they never get below 5.5, and then they have a rapid recovery to close to physiological pH in the mouth, around 7 after that. So to limit these oral pH drops below 5.5, I add sodium bicarbonate, which is a base, 1 gram per 100 mils, which is pretty close to physiological saline, or the concentration of physiological saline, to the homemade mouthwash. So, all right, what else is in that mouthwash then? So P. gingivalis has been linked with a bunch of adverse health-related conditions, both inside and outside of the mouth, as shown there. And for test number 1, I did indeed have a small amount of this bacterium that's been shown to be related to each of the conditions in red. So 0.2% of my total bacteria were from P. gingivalis. Now, peppermint oil has been shown in vitro studies to inhibit the growth of this bacterium. So also in the mouthwash is a couple of drops of peppermint oil per 1,000 mils. And I've since increased it to 3 to 4 drops for test number 2. And without going into that data, I was actually able to reduce or eliminate, so from 0.2 to 0, which is good news, potentially good news. So in terms of what's good, I have no Streptococcus mutants, which are linked with cavity formation, relatively low levels of P. gingivalis, and then relatively high levels of those oral health-related bacteria, Neisseria and Rothia. But what's not good? So for the first test, I had salivary levels, in this case, that were greater than 0.2% of total bacteria that were linked with adverse oral and or systemic health, and I've indicated them there. So then how could I reduce levels of at least some of these bacteria? So a study was published in 2020 that has indicated that nitrate may be a potential prebiotic for the oral microbiome. And for those who may not know, a prebiotic are things that feed already existing bacteria, thereby enabling their growth. So starting with a diet rich in nitrate, there's a direct effect where nitrate from the food is in the mouth, and nitrate in the mouth will then be consumed by these nitrate-reducing bacteria, so you get growth of the nitrate-reducing bacteria like Neisseria and Rothia in the mouth. And then there's an indirect effect of eating a diet rich in nitrate, where you get an increase in plasma levels of nitrate that concentrates in the parotid gland and other salivary glands, which then secrete nitrate into the mouth, thereby enabling the whole process of increased nitrate-reducing bacteria. So how does nitrate impact the oral microbiome? And this was done in saliva from 12 healthy donors, which was then incubated with nitrate. And then what happened to the oral microbiome composition? So that's what we're looking at there on the y-axis. And this was 5 and 9 hours after saliva was incubated with nitrate. And what they saw were significant increase for the oral health-related bacteria, Neisseria and Rothia, in the presence of nitrate, and then significant reductions for caries and halitosis-related bacteria in the presence of nitrate. And for others that I have, greater than 0.2% amounts of, like the two indicated there, Treponema and Tannerella, they weren't significant, but they're trending in the right direction at least, when considering it was a small study of 12 people. So then the question is, if I want to further improve my oral microbiome health, how can I increase oral nitrate? So with the goal of optimizing oral bacterial composition, should I eat more nitrate-consuming foods? And that's because, as we saw, diet rich in nitrate stimulates this increase in oral nitrate levels. Now, I'm already on a high nitrate diet, though. And we can see that here, these are foods that I commonly consume, and then their nitrate content. And because I track my diet and weigh everything with a food scale, I know exactly how much of these foods that I was eating for the 2-month period before my oral microbiome test. And since we know the nitrate content of these foods, I can calculate how much nitrate I'm getting from each of these foods on a daily basis, and then take the sum, and we can see that my average nitrate intake is close to 1,900. At least for this test, it was close to 1,900 milligrams per day. So to put that in context, what's been recommended as an acceptable daily intake for nitrate is 3.7 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So for my close to current body weight of 69 kilograms, an acceptable daily intake for nitrate would be about 256 milligrams per day. So I'm 7 to 8 times higher based on what's considered an acceptable intake. So I'm already on a high nitrate diet. It doesn't make sense to further increase that through diet, which then goes to the targeted supplementation approach of adding it to the mouthwash. So for the second test, after the first test, I added potassium nitrate to that homemade mouthwash, which then the question becomes how much nitrate and how often. So how much is unknown. There are no published RCTs on giving potassium nitrate to human volunteers and then tracking their microbiome over time. Now, what was in this in vitro study where they incubated the saliva with potassium nitrate, I went with 4 grams of potassium nitrate per 1,000 mils, which was 64 millimolar, which was 10 times higher than the concentration used in the in vitro study. And again, who knows how much is optimal, but that's what I started with. So then in terms of how much nitrate and how often, like how often should the mouthwash be used, independent of, okay, I just ate a meal, I'm gonna floss and then gargle so I don't have any oral acidity, that's the easy, obvious answer. But aside from that, how much and how often? So here we're looking at nitrate levels after the saliva was incubated with nitrate, and you can see immediately after the saliva was incubated with nitrate, there was a big increase here relative to no nitrate. But then after 5 hours of nitrate being added, you can see almost all of it has been consumed, and then 9 hours after incubating saliva with nitrate, it's all been consumed. So using the mouthwash once every 5 hours or 9 hours at the latest was my approach going from test number 1 to test number 2. So then the question is, did the levels of nitrate reducing bacteria further increase and levels of the quote unquote bad bacteria decrease? So for the test number 2 update, and again, I won't have time to go through all of that data here. I did make a second video for that, and that too is on my YouTube channel. I have a kit that I'm ready to do test number 3, but that'll be coming up probably in about a month. So for the test number 2, I actually having this much nitrate in my mouthwash didn't increase my levels of nitrate reducing bacteria. In fact, it decreased from 53% to 46%. So how I could have more nitrate in the mouthwash but not impact levels of nitrate reducing bacteria suggests that I've already maximized my levels of nitrate reducing bacteria with my high nitrate diet. And then, as I mentioned, I was able to eliminate, at least for this test, P. gingivalis, whether that was because of the peppermint oil or something else, I don't know. I was able to reduce levels of bacteria related to gum inflammation, but then about 5%, 5.5%, somewhere in that range, of my oral bacteria are related to halitosis, and I wasn't able to impact that, and I can't imagine anybody would want to have bad breath-related bacteria, so that's a work in progress. So with that in mind, I'm ready for more questions if anybody has them. So, yeah.
So instead of using those super physiologic doses of nitrate, why not use a product like Neo 40 or just eat a bunch of beans? That'd be question 1. And question 2, is it going to be something in your mouthwash, with the bacteria creating nitric oxide? Could something even in your homemade mouthwash be killing the bacteria and maybe negatively impacting your nitric oxide?
Yeah, right. So to answer the first question, so the commercially available mouthwashes, that some of them that do have nitrate or other stuff that's been shown to impact oral health, it gets expensive very quickly. Most of those products are like $10. I'd probably go through a relatively small bottle in 2 or 3 days. I mean, $10 might not seem like much, but I'm not trying to spend $400 a year or more on mouthwash when I can probably make it at home with the same ingredients, or even better, put the ingredients in there that may be targeted. Now, to your second question, that's a great point. I cut my nitrate in the mouthwash down from 4 grams per day to 2 grams for the next test. Because that is possible. It's possible that I can get to super physiological doses, and now I'm actually suppressing levels of somehow I'm messing up the system by going super physiological. But from the first test to the second test, it was mostly the same. I wouldn't state the conclusion that having too much nitrate completely blew up the system. But that it didn't improve, at least the nitrate-reducing bacteria, argues that I can reduce it. And I don't know, eliminate it. What's interesting, and this is completely anecdotal, I had white lines on the inside of my cheeks that I would bite for a very long time, and we're talking decades. I mean, I remember my dentist in my 20s saying, "Do you bite the inside of your cheeks?" And I don't know if that was cause or consequence. Was I biting it because I had something there? It's called linea alba. Was I biting it because that was there, or did I create it by biting it, right? So after I started with the nitrate supplementation, it went away. So I don't want to get rid of it yet. I'm not ready to make the conclusion that having that there has messed up the whole composition, because when looking at it by percentages, gum inflammation and periodontitis and all of the other bacteria, most of that stayed pretty close to the same with some small improvements. So having nitrate there didn't blow up the system, is, I guess, the answer to the question.
Yeah, I guess my worry would be taking anything that kills mouth bacteria, the negative effect that might have on your nitric oxide production. Right. So just not using mouthwash at all, just brushing your teeth every every day and then maybe taking a DO40 or beads, maybe you could achieve some of the health gains without the, doing a mouthwash or something. I mean, I don't know, it's all, who knows?
No, it's a definite possibility. I'm completely open to it. It doesn't have to be the mouthwash. In theory, I should have some data. I should generate some data without the mouthwash, just toothbrushing and a couple hours later with water rinsing or whatever, just to see what it looks like without it, right? So I expect, just like the blood test data, I expect to have a considerable number of oral microbiome tests to really see what does. I mean, this is still early stages. It's 2 data points, so. But with enough data, too, I'll be able to see, should it be more beets? Should it be more nitrate? Is it something I need to do locally with a mouthwash, right? So, yeah, great points.
Did you test your nitric oxide levels at the saliva?
I've thought about that, though, but no, not yet, not yet. All right, got it. All right, thanks, everybody.